So hello there, in today's video I'm going to share with you some common mistakes I make. I always make doing landscape photography, and then I'll give you a few tips on how to avoid them. Let's go. Before we get into that though, I've taken a break from landscape photography recently and immersed myself again in water drop photography. It's been fun, it's been exciting, and in that time I have created the water drop photography masterclass. It's all included in the Raw Room along with the Landscape Photography Masterclass, one-to-one critiques, a monthly photo challenge, a podcast, other tutorials, and lots more. Hit the link down below to subscribe now for just £5.99 a month. It's available internationally and you can cancel at any time. So after my break from landscape photography recently, I headed out yesterday up to North Yorkshire, one of my favourite places in the entire world to shoot, because at this time of year particularly, the heather is in full bloom and it just looks fantastic, especially when you get some of that really warm, beautiful sunlight on it. I was there to rekindle my passion for landscape photography again and to make a vlog for you, because I know a lot of you love those vlogs. Now, over the last couple of years, every time I've gone out, I have made a vlog, and I've been happy usually with the video and with the pictures I've got. But yesterday, it didn't go so well. It did not go well at all. I felt absolutely terrible about the images I'd made. I didn't feel like I had anything particularly interesting to say to the camera, and I came away feeling like the whole thing had been a massive failure. So since last night, that got me thinking about the mistakes I made. Not only the mistakes, but how I then deal with those mistakes. And I'm not always very successful at that second bit. And that leads me pretty much into the first mistake I made, which is giving in to the self-doubt and the self-criticism. Self-doubt and self-criticism are a hugely important part of the artistic process. Being curious is important. Asking questions is important. It's just important throughout life, and it gets beaten out of us as we go through the school system, where we're taught not to question authority and things. But I think it's really important, and that includes questioning yourself, because you don't want to blindly think you are creating the best images in the entire world. It's very natural as an artist, I think, to be self-critical, question yourself and consider whether that work is good or not. But sometimes it tips over a little bit too far. And I come across this with people that I speak to being hugely self-critical, thinking they're terrible photographers, when actually they're creating some really beautiful work, and I'm absolutely no different. And that happened yesterday. Like I said, I felt terrible about the images I was creating, and I was being a little bit too hard on myself. The way to overcome that is to calm down and to slow down. That's what we always tell people. It's become a bit of a cliche that when doing landscape photography, slow down to get your composition, to get your story correct. But yesterday, I failed to do that. Even though I was out for about 4 or 5 hours in the late afternoon and evening, I still just wasn't doing the right thing at the right time, and I started to panic and couldn't overcome it. Now, I think one of the reasons for this was a new problem I've come across, and it was definitely a mistake I made yesterday, and that's being overly reliant on my phone. Now, a phone is a great way to go out and scout a location, especially these days because they take such beautiful images. Since I upgraded my phone, I've just been blown away by the pictures, and they look so good on the back of on that bigger screen. The images look vibrant, they look saturated, and it sort of convinces you that it's taking better images than you are on your DSLR camera. And yesterday I was sort of trying to compose images with my phone before I did it with my camera. Because it was bright conditions, I was finding it easier to see on the back of the phone as well. So I was getting frustrated that the images I was taking on my phone, I felt like I then couldn't recreate that with my DSLR. I was getting frustrated, annoyed, and again, my self-doubt and my self-criticism snuck in, and I just couldn't overcome it. That led me to the point where I was almost going to call this video "My phone took better images than I did." But when I've got back today and I've processed my images, the ones I've taken, particularly of this scene here, just look so much better taken on my DSLR camera. That quite nicely leads me on to the next mistake I made yesterday, and that is to rely too much on what the screen on the back of your camera is showing you. Now that screen, the camera creates a JPEG file to show you. Even if you're shooting just in RAW, the camera will display a JPEG on the back of the screen. Now that JPEG does not have the same amount of sharpness. It doesn't have the same amount of dynamic range. It doesn't have the same amount of vibrance and saturation as that RAW file is potentially going to have. It depends on what picture style you set as well, and that can trick you. To get it right technically as well, I also needed to get my shutter speed up because that heather was blowing around so much. I wanted to get the shutter speed up to somewhere around 1/200th of a second. I was at f16 because I was so close and I wanted sharp detail in the foreground. I then had to up my ISO to 1250. I know from experience that my camera can handle that. But when I've taken that image, what I thought was technically correct, it just didn't look very good on the back of the screen. But then when I've got it back into the computer, post-processed it, had a look at it, I'm actually really, really happy with the image. But because I was relying on that screen yesterday, I was so frustrated that I wasn't doing the right thing, or I felt like I wasn't doing the right thing. And it just tricked me into believing that. And then again, my self-doubt then started creeping in. I felt bad about what I was doing and I didn't enjoy the process. Now again, I'm sure I'll make this mistake again. In future though, I need to trust in my own experience and not rely too much on what that JPEG on the back of the screen is showing me. Now another mistake I made yesterday, because I was relying on my phone too much, is I wasn't considering properly the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio of my phone is 4:3, where the aspect ratio of my DSLR camera is 3:2, so it's slightly different. An important thing when we're composing a landscape photograph is to consider what is happening around the edges of our frame. The things we include in the image are important, but equally the things that we exclude from that image are important as well. And there are times when you will get into position, you will have almost the perfect composition, but there are things creeping either into the edges of the frame or into the top and the bottom of the frame. And one way that we can still make that work is to adjust the aspect ratio, or to think differently about the aspect ratio beyond what our cameras provide. Now you might want to turn that into a 4:3 or a square crop to cut the edges off, like in this image here, or like this image here where it's just, there's too much sky, so I've cropped it down to a 16:9. And I know I've got the composition right, but just by trimming those edges down to a different aspect ratio, it just makes these images turns these images from an average shot into a good shot. Now that leads me on to another mistake I made yesterday, and that is not considering the post-processing at the time of shooting the image. So that does apply to aspect ratio as well. But I talked very recently about when we are out in the field doing our landscape photography, we should, or it's a great idea to consider the final piece of work or the final print at the time of making the image, because it will help us formulate and think about the whole process to craft that image at the scene. And that's something I definitely didn't do yesterday. I always suggest when you get into a landscape is the first thing that catches your eye, you should pay attention to that. Trust in that instinct of that thing that has attracted your attention and you consider to be interesting or beautiful. And that happened to me yesterday with this tree here. It doesn't look like a particularly interesting image at all. But when I was there, that single tree caught my attention because it looked beautiful. It was almost symmetrical and stood out so much from the background. But then when I initially took a shot, it didn't stand out at all because it was getting lost a little bit in that background. But I knew with my own eyes that the white of that silver birch did stand out. But because my camera doesn't see the way I did, I wasn't thinking beyond that. I was so reliant on what was happening on the back of the screen. But then this morning, I've put it into post-processing and I've matched what my vision with how I felt at the time and created what I'm now really, really happy with turning it into a black and white image and putting all the focus, all that attention on the tree and then isolating it from the background. Now yesterday when I took this, I felt absolutely terrible about it. But then this morning, I'm really happy with it. And it's silly that I felt like that. I'm annoyed with myself that I felt like that because And the reason that happened was because I wasn't considering the entire process at the time of taking the photograph. And that was the mistake I made. Another mistake I made yesterday, but I think I managed to solve it about halfway through, was to rely too much on your tripod. If you rely too much on your tripod, there's a good chance that you are going to miss an opportunity. There's a good chance that you will not be exploring all the possible perspectives and compositions by not getting your camera down low enough, because it can be quite difficult and irritating to take your camera from a sort of a standing position to a low position. But it's really easy to take the camera off the tripod and try out, move that camera around until you find the right position, and you can then set your tripod up in that position. There's also a great deal to be said for hand-holding landscape photographs. This is particularly the case if you're walking, you're going on a walk, or you're with people. Having that ability to take a great landscape photograph handheld will really just benefit your landscape photography. And I don't do this enough. And that's another mistake I make. I did do it a little bit yesterday, and I actually came away with a really great shot. Even at the time, again, I didn't feel particularly good about it. I'm happy with this image as a handheld shot. And your images don't need to be technically perfect every single time. And sometimes if you handhold them, they may not be. I do strive for technical perfection, but not at the expense of missing the shot. Now, I've seen some strange advice recently on how to take a handheld landscape photograph, and these are the settings I use, and they work on almost every single occasion. So I start with shutter speed, because I'm not going to rely on any kind of stabilization to get my sharp shots. So I up the shutter speed to something like 1/125th, 1/160th, or 1/200th of a second for my shutter speed. And that means even if the camera moves a little bit, or you get some movement in some leaves or some branches, it will freeze that action and you will get sharp shots. I will usually shoot at about f11, which means at that shutter speed that will be quite dark. So I then balance that out with my ISO. Yesterday I was shooting at something like 640 ISO most of the time with those settings. But you can either leave it in auto ISO or just set it for the moment so you're shooting in full manual. But don't be afraid to raise that ISO to allow you to get that shutter speed up so you get nice, sharp images. Now, the final mistake yesterday, and it's one I make way too often, and that is taking on too much. For me yesterday, I was trying to do a vlog. I was trying to take a really great photograph. I was interested in doing a tutorial as well for the Roaring, but it was just too much, and I felt like I failed across the board. Now, there are different ways we all take on too much. I've also got a bad back at the moment, and I think I walked too far. Physically, we shouldn't be taking on too much, especially as a lot of us get that little bit older. It's to our detriment. We are all, again, raised with that kind of belief that you've got to push all the time. And people can get into real problems with that. That's particularly the case when climbing a mountain. I got contacted by a viewer recently who was inspired by my work to go and climb a mountain, and he pretty much ended up pushed through and pretty much ended up having a heart attack, and then later realized he needed a triple heart bypass. And it's really important not to push yourself, especially if you've not done much exercise recently. Climbing a mountain is very difficult, not just physically but also mentally as well. A big part of it is the mental challenge as we go through that difficult physical challenge. My advice, if you're going to do something like that, is to monitor your heart rate. For me, and it's different for everybody, for me, my heart rate, if I'm in the 140 to 160 zone, I know I'm comfortable at that zone doing exercise. So when you start out, find that zone where you feel comfortable doing some exercise. And if it goes up above that, and you can feel it a lot of the time, where it just gets so hard, take a rest, take a breath, get your heart rate back down, and then go again. And what you'll find is as you get fitter, you can achieve more and more staying in that same heart rate zone. It's a really great way to exercise. It's a really great way to control your heart rate and not end up being the victim of a heart attack halfway up the hill. So yeah, big learning experience for me yesterday, but I'd love to hear some of the mistakes you make. How do you overcome them? Do you think you'll make them again? Let me know down in the comments. Check out the Raw Room, subscribe, like, do what you need to do, and I'll see you on another one very soon. I'm Adam, this is First Man Photography, out.